All right, let's see here. All right, welcome everyone. We're gonna ease into this presentation, but we'll start welcoming people. This is how to manage dual US and UK university applications. And it's gonna be myself, Josh Davis from ESM Prep, and I'm joined here by Harriet from Keystone Tutors. And for anyone that's ever done a webinar, just know that we're gonna wait a little while until people join, just about a minute or so. But we do have a Q&A feature and a chat feature where it's usually going to be at the top of your page or the bottom of your page potentially. But please feel free to use the Q&A throughout the presentation, and we will try to address your questions either during the live slides or perhaps more towards the end. But if you do have questions throughout, please feel free again to use the Q&A feature. This presentation is basically going to go over all the important elements of both the American and the UK, university systems, and the things to know about each system, each country, how they evaluate students, what they value. So hopefully you, your child, maybe friends, children, whatever it may be, are looking at either one or both options, and we're here to kind of again offer some insight into the process. But we're going to wait another 30 seconds or so before we kind of jump in. Okay, so again, for those of you that are just joining now, welcome to the webinar on US UK universities. And again, there is a Q&A feature at the top of the screen where you can ask any questions, but we will provide a lot of information. And I think we're good to go, Harriet. So again, thank you everyone for joining. My name is Josh Davis from ESM Prep. I'm joined here again by Harriet. We are counselors, obviously, educational consultants and counselors working with students and families around the world on anything to do with their academic journeys. I tend to specialize in the US system and Harriet in the UK. Harriet, if you want to give a brief introduction.
Sure, thanks, Josh. So yeah, as Josh says, I work for Keystone Tutors. I am the head of consultancy for Keystone, and within that, a huge amount of what we do is to advise families about UK university applications. So we only look at the UK, that's the region that we work with. And we have offices in Hong Kong, Singapore, and in London. So we work with families applying from all over the world. And the reason that we find this webinar that we've offered for a number of years now really beneficial for families that we work with is because actually an increasing number of people are starting to kind of think about applying to both UK and US universities, and potentially even another area as well. So juggling the application process is fundamental with that, to make sure that the applications are equally robust. And as a result, it's helpful just to see them alongside each other to get a good sense of the timelines and what is required to put together a really strong dual application.
Yeah, exactly. It's first of all, the thing we want to say, it's very doable, right? As long as you kind of have a plan laid out, and you're smart about your choices, where to apply, and obviously the things that kind of go into it. So ESM Prep is similar to Keystone in many ways. We work with students around the world. We have offices based in the West Coast in California, as well as on the East Coast in the US. But in London, we've been open since 2015. And we've also had offices in Tokyo in the past. So, we have a pretty good idea of the international system. I myself grew up in Belgium, went to international school, got very, very lucky and was able to go to Yale for undergrad, and worked at Yale admissions for 3 years, where I kind of got a little bit of a sense, especially in terms of international students, what they were looking for, and the criteria that you need to kind of follow to put yourself in position to be successful in the process. So, we'll be sharing a little bit of that insight. We'll have an overview, obviously, of the UK applications, compare those to what the US process looks like, and then just kind of give people some timeline suggestions on, if you're going to go through a dual track, here's where you need to be, depending on the time of your high school kind of career. And then of course we'll take questions. So first things first, All you, Harriet, the UK.
Great, thank you, Josh. So obviously this could be a webinar in its own right, so I'm just going to give quite a whistle-stop overview of what a UK university application entails. It won't be kind of really specific to certain subjects and things like that. So if you are interested in learning more, then do get in touch following this webinar. I'm very happy to have an initial consultation with anyone who needs one. But to start with, the university application in the UK is centralised. So it's all within something called UCAS. And that is something that you log into, set up an account, and it is where everything to do with your university application lives, essentially. So it is quite a sort of kind of slick system in a way. There isn't lots that you need to juggle in terms of different types of application with UK universities. You just set up your UCAS account and that's where everything goes. You will put your academic history in there. You will put your, your key details like your name, address, and all of those sorts of things. And then one of the only areas within that UCAS account where you get to sort of express yourself and why you want to study this degree choice is in your personal statement. So without, unless you're looking at going to Oxford and Cambridge, everything that you need to express yourself specifically, it lives within your personal statement, which is a 4,000 character, including spaces, document. So that document is really important when you're looking at a university application to UK universities. And the core of that personal statement really needs to focus on your academic interests. So whilst I'd never discourage any teenager from having lots of extracurricular activities and interests, it is certainly true that in a UK application, your personal statement really needs to be very, very focused around your academic interests in that subject area and what you've done to prove that you've explored that independently. So the more academically selective and competitive the university or universities you're applying to, the more that counts. So do think about your extracurricular and supercurricular activities. Yes, that's really important, but everything needs to very much focus in on that degree choice and what you've done to evidence your independent interest in that subject. So that's a really important element. It's something that's essential to say within your UCAS application is that you have 5 university choices, and that personal statement that you write is the same document that goes to all 5 universities. So you don't get to create anything bespoke. You don't get to express why you specifically want to go to one university because they all receive the same document. So it does need to be relevant to all 5 courses, and it is a really important step in the process. The only other area where you get, or the university gets to sense a little bit more about you as an applicant and what you're like and how teachable you are and things like that, is in the reference, which again is one document that's within your UCAS application that goes to 5 universities. That is written by someone within your school who knows you, who has perhaps taught you or been your personal tutor or been the person advising you about UK universities. But it is really important for those applying from non-UK regions for their schools to be aware of their goals and what they're looking to do in the UK, so that they can be confident that the referee, the person writing that reference, has a really good sense of what the university will need to see and know within that document. But really it is designed to reinforce what the personal statement says. So the university just wants to be confident that they're choosing someone that really, really wants to study that degree and who is going to be a good fit in that university environment. And it is important. So I'd really encourage anyone who's applying from overseas to speak to their school advisors early and make sure that whoever is providing that reference really knows what they're doing and what they need to include within that. So that's really the core of the UCAS application. You've got information about yourself, academic history, perhaps if you have any disabilities, learning requirements, things like that, that would be included there too. You've got your personal statement and a reference. You will also put in your 5 university choices into that. And if you've got grades that are pending, so if you have not received all of your certificated grades yet, so you haven't completed your school, then those will be put in as pending, and whoever is completing your reference will submit those pending grades as predictions, which the university will then use when they're considering whether or not to make you an offer. Outside of that, there are some universities that will offer applicants interviews and require entrance exams. Those tend to be Oxbridge, who will interview every applicant, well, not necessarily interview, but whoever they're looking to take through to the next stage will always have an interview. But also, if you're looking at studying vocational degrees, non-Oxbridge universities will often require an interview as well. So things like medicine, law, perhaps engineering, degrees like that, they might require an interview. And then finally, entrance exams. Again, Oxbridge more often than not. So Oxford certainly, Cambridge for some courses won't necessarily have an entry assessment, but might have an at-interview assessment. So it's really important that if you're looking at doing this, you're thinking about those steps as well. And if you are looking at a university like Oxford or Cambridge, that you've mapped out what happens when. And other university courses that will also require an entry assessment, again, things like law, which require something called the LNAT, which it's important that candidates know about these things because they will need to register for them independently. It doesn't happen automatically within your UCAS. You will need to make sure that you're taking those steps and not missing any deadlines. So really that's the sort of UCAS application in a nutshell. What I would encourage anyone to do who's thinking about university application is to just take a look at the UCAS website. They've been pretty proactive about getting lots of content on there, and it's getting better and better. And there are some really short videos that will just explain what you need to know and how it works and show you what the UCAS form actually looks like. So that's a very good starting point.
Quick couple questions from my end. On the personal stand, so let's say if I want to study like business studies, and 3 of my unis offer that, but then maybe the last 2, it's not business specifically, maybe it's more economics or something else. In the personal statement, if you're kind of like naming the subject and then the university sees like, oh, like, we don't have that one, you get kind of penalized for that, or how does that part work?
Yeah, so often that is something that happens, in that there are some courses that are only offered by a small number of universities, and therefore applicants actually don't have the option of 5 places that offer that course. Or perhaps, as you say, there might be business, there might be management, you know, there are courses that perhaps overlap. I think it's important to kind of consider how it looks from the admission team perspective, in that obviously if they can see that you're looking at, you know, clearly looking at another course, they're going to pick someone that they know is fully committed to their course. But I think where there is significant overlap, you can engineer a personal statement in such a way that it is relevant to both courses. I'd say I'd look at it on case by case, but I have seen a lot of people who have applied to a number of different courses, with the same personal statement, and it's worked, but it does require a little bit more thought into how that is put together in the statement.
Okay, and then we have a question as well from an audience member. In terms of the reference, is it written by a secondary school, so like a GCSE teacher, or someone, an A-level teacher from lower secondary?
That is quite dependent on the school. So usually it will be written by a sort of personal tutor or someone who knows the student quite well, so not necessarily a specific teacher. But what most schools will do is request a short paragraph from each subject teacher at the school about how the applicant, works in class and what their strengths are, and they will then integrate those paragraphs into the reference. So that's not the way that they have to be done, but a lot of schools do it in that way. So they will say, literally, like, as his physics teacher says, and then just insert a really positive paragraph about how that child is working within the school, and then provide a bit of a summary at the end. So there's no rule on who provides the reference, but it tends to be, in the UK, certainly in boarding schools, a house parent or a personal tutor. But in day schools, similar sort of a personal tutor, or even in some cases a sort of deputy head type role. But I think the main thing is it's someone who knows the applicant well, and can give a good overview of why they'd be a good choice for the university.
Okay. And then the entrance exams, what can students expect from that? Let's say if I want to study psychology, but I haven't maybe taken it at A level, maybe it's not offered at my high school, but I know I want to do psychology. How can I prepare for that? Is it very subject specific?
So psychology would be an example that isn't actually offered by huge numbers of schools in the UK anyway. So there wouldn't be an expectation that you have studied psychology before. And if you were being assessed for it, it would likely be more an exam, a more general exam that sees kind of how you learn and take on information, and what you can then do with that. So I'd say that you definitely need to prepare for entry assessment, but if they're in subjects that aren't offered ordinarily by schools, they're not going to be subject specific in that way. They're going to be more about whether you've got the capacity to take on information, how you use that, and then how you can develop it. So all of the universities that do have entry assessments provide mock papers and things on their websites. There's loads of information out there. I would say that particularly in a situation where someone's going for US and UK, if you do have these exams that will happen in sort of November time, you do need to set aside quite a lot of time to make sure you're prepared, because particularly Oxbridge use the assessment as quite a fundamental part of their entry criteria. It's one of the only elements where they get to really distinguish one candidate from another, because inevitably anyone who's applying to Oxford or Cambridge has a very good academic track record and will have a convincing personal statement on the whole. So the entry assessment is a really kind of good way for them to get a little bit more data to then use in their selection process.
Okay, that makes sense. So I think we'll transition to the US, which has a few more elements, maybe is a little bit more complicated, especially for someone who hasn't been through the system. But so these are some of the components of a US application. So, we listed here demonstrated interest, extracurricular activities, the SAT or ACT, which is the US version of the entry exams, recommendation letters, which are obviously like the references, the application itself, also a personal statement, but of course they want more, so they make you write supplemental essays, and then the interview. So kind of going through those one by one. The demonstrated interest is more part of like the research of figuring out where the right fit might be. And then, it's kind of gone through a bit of a shift with COVID, but essentially, if there's 4,000 universities to choose from in the US, there's different ways to show that you have interest. One is potentially to use what's called early decision, which is this binding contract that a student, a parent, and the school would sign that tells the university, hey, if I apply here, this is my first choice, and I am 100% going if I get in, right? And that's a card that, especially for international students, tends to be a little bit, yes, it shows that I'm very interested, but that it also removes any optionality that I have. So, demonstrated interest could just be visiting the university, doing some kind of summer course there, attending the Fulbright Fair in the UK, which is obviously actually this weekend for anyone that's in London. and stopping by their booth or potentially emailing the admissions rep. So there's different ways to kind of create an initial relationship, but that part does have a little bit of value. But most importantly, it is the academics. And the first thing they want to see is kind of how rigorous your curriculum and your course load is. So for students, for example, taking A levels, the word around the admissions offices in the US is that they need to take 4 A levels, right? That's already a way for students to kind of distinguish themselves from many other applicants, because obviously in the UK, the norm is 3, and you're not necessarily expected to complete all 4 over your 2 years of sixth form. But a lot of students who want to show, hey, I'm ready to challenge myself, I'm taking advanced courses and I'm taking more courses than others, that tends to be a nice way. And then obviously you have to perform well within those rigorous courses, right? It's not necessarily the right formula for everyone to take the hardest classes, but then you struggle with them and you're predicted B's and C's at A levels. You obviously want to take classes that give you a good chance of getting an A or an A star. They do consider your GCSE marks, so that does matter. Everything starting from year 10 onwards. So 9th grade is the US equivalent, but year 10 in the UK, that's when it starts to count. For students who are in the IB, system, again, obviously your 11th and 12th grade classes or year 12, year 13 classes, and your predicted grades, predicted score will really, really matter, but they'll also consider your grades, from the first 2 years of secondary school. So, the 4-year kind of academic record, just like in the UK, has, a lot of importance. And then after they evaluate your academic profile, that's when they start looking at, you basically get put into a pile, and then they're like, okay, now that you're in this pile of, students who could handle the university workload, we try to figure out SAT, ACT, the scores are published online. Every university, a couple are going away from it, but most universities will share their 25th to 75th percentile. So if we use the ACT, for example, which is one of the 2 entrance exams that's most commonly used, a school might say, hey, we need someone between a 28 and a 32. And that 50% of students who are admitted have a score between the 28 and 32. And we know that 25% of students will have higher than 32 and 25% of students will be below a 28. So if I'm at a 25, I'm probably not looking at the right school. But if I'm at a 34, then I can feel pretty good about my chances. So that's another way to kind of like start filtering which schools might be a right choice. But we're also not saying, because of the holistic nature of the US, that like if you don't have the score, you have no chance, right? A lot of schools are either test optional, so they don't even require an SAT or ACT score right now. But it is worth obviously kind of being realistic and knowing that like a lot of the students applying will submit test scores within the range, and that's just like an advantage they'll have over a student who doesn't submit. And then after kind of those numeric data points with the grades and the test scores, they start really looking at the extracurricular profile pretty early on. On the application, there's room to kind of put in up to 10 activities. And as Harriet mentioned, and we'll talk about the differences, but you don't necessarily have to have them all focused around your academic subject. But the other myth is that you don't have to have everything, right? I hear a lot of students say like, hey, I can't really apply to the US. I don't have any performing arts, right? Or I don't play sports, or I don't do hours and hours of community service. Therefore, I'm basically going to be eliminated, right? And the reality is no. The first piece of advice is to have an actual passion or a main interest or a hook that is kind of like the central focus of your high school experience or secondary school experience, right? It's the one thing that you enjoy doing the most. And what's good is that, even if I want to study, sociology, but I play tennis, like I will get credit for pursuing tennis at a high level, right? If I do up to 15 hours a week of training, that is something that they value. They like commitments, they like consistency, they like growth and leadership, right? So any kind of extracurriculars that showcase, that kind of journey will be valued. And every profile is meant to look different. There are no 2 profiles that look the same, and it has to be very, very authentic. So the things that you do, over the summer, whether it's a course or an internship or some kind of trip, or throughout half term, you work on a community service project, or obviously throughout the whole year, if you're in a school club or outside of school club, they want to make sure that students kind of stay active outside the classroom. and then still maximize their grades and test scores within the classroom. And then after the extracurriculars, the recommendation letters are very, very important. Most universities will require 2 teachers, so specifically written by teachers. So, you can have a math teacher and a science teacher, or an English teacher and a history teacher, whatever it may be, but you have 2 teachers. And then on top of that, there's also a school counselor recommendation, which is kind of similar to, maybe it's head of careers, head of sixth form, a housemaster, anyone that knows a student outside the classroom, but can also give context around, hey, this is how many students from our school applied to the US, or here's where they've gone, here's how Josh compares to those students. So again, there's a lot of different adult perspectives to kind of like shape out the evaluation of the student. And again, those references tend to be more character-based than academic ability based, right? Which I think is another kind of key difference we'll distinguish. But typically it's the teachers that know you best, that have a sense of why you're the kind of kid that's going to make a difference in the community. Maybe it's why that teacher really values you, again, as a human being. So it has to go beyond, Josh is a good student and he pays attention in class. It has to be, this is why I really love teaching him. Some people feel it's a bit over the top, right? One kind of like the glowing nature of it, but again, it's how you get to stand out. And then there, kind of similar to UCAS, there's a few different application systems in the US. The most common one is called the Common App, which has hundreds and hundreds of universities. A few that are not on there would be like MIT, Georgetown, the UCs, UCLA, UC Berkeley. Those ones just happen to be on different platforms, but the Common App would really be the main one. And then yes, the personal statement is to use to tell universities really who you are. And I know that sounds very kind of fluffy in a way, but it really is that, right? I need to tell a story that highlights my passions, that highlights my growth. Maybe there's a little bit of adversity in there, but it doesn't have to be a sob story, right? Maybe there's some inspiration in there. Maybe there's humor, but something that really shows, hey, this is a moment in my life that kind of explains why I'm going the way I'm going. And essentially someone that's never met you has to be able to read that and feel some kind of connection to you. And these are not academically based. They can be, but for the most part, they're not. And it's only 650 words, right? So it's actually very close to the 4,000 character limit on the UCAS, but you don't get the spaces. That's the part that is probably a little bit different. And then you have supplemental essays for each university that are very specific. So the personal statement obviously goes to every university. You shouldn't mention any university by name. And the supplement essays might say, okay, like, why do you want to study at school X? What kind of courses would you take? What is it about the university that stood out? And sometimes they might ask you completely different questions on like, what brings you joy? Or, what was the hardest moment of your life? They're just trying to ask all these different questions to just get more information about a student. And they take time, right? Those take time and they're a nice complement to the personal statement. And then finally, the interview, which comes, after submitting for the majority of schools, is again different than the UK, where it's not conducted by someone, who works for the university, but it's more someone that has a connection to the university, which is often alumni, typically in the city that you're applying from. So for students applying from London, they'll try to arrange an interview with someone who's based in London that went to the university. And, I think we're getting back to like coffee at Starbucks or potentially at the person's office. Obviously they've been on Zoom or Google Meets or whatever for the last few years. And yeah, they're very informal in nature, the interviews. And it's basically, can you, maintain a conversation with an adult for 45 minutes or so, and be engaging and be truthful when they ask you questions. So that's the general overview. And then here we're going to kind of talk about some of the key differences.
I just had a question, Josh, on the supplemental essays. Do all universities require those? And also, how long are they usually meant to be?
Sure. So can't say that every school does, right? There's like a famous kind of list of schools that don't require a supplement. So some students will kind of see that and say, oh, I can just apply there without having to do more work. But pretty much all the top universities will have some kind of question, and they range from literally single word answers. You know, USC will ask like, what's your favorite TV show? What's your favorite snack? What's your dream trip? And kids are like, how, if I answer this, like, what do they want to hear? Like, you know, does it sound like very ambitious? And it's hard to say, hey, yeah, this is the way to answer that. It's, again, be truthful. But, you know, typically I'd say 150 words, 250 words. The longest would be maybe 500 words. So, you know, some schools will have 2, some will have 8, Stanford. So again, it's like, and you have to think, okay, I've already mentioned this part of my life, so I'm going to talk about these other parts in different essays. So again, you have to be very strategic in the way you answer them.
Wow. And just in terms of you say up to 20 or as many as 20, what would be the average, would you say, of universities that people go for?
Yeah, please don't apply to 20 universities, people. The Common App just allows you to put in 20, and then beyond that, it says, hey, this is too much. But, you know, most students, because of the way the process works out, where you have ideally that early decision in round 1, and then maybe you have a couple of what's called early action also in round 1. And again, this is this, you know, we're getting into the weeds, right? So if people have specific questions about like, well, how many schools can you apply to early action? Which schools? Feel free to reach out to us. But essentially, you might have like 4 or 5 in the early round. And obviously, if you get into your first choice, the binding one, you're done, right? You find out in December and then that's it. And you have to go there. And usually that's like a good thing, not necessarily a bad thing. It's actually a great thing. But some students are still active in what's called the second round or the regular round. And then they might apply to anywhere from like 6 to 8 more. So, you know, you're looking anywhere from like 8 to 12 on average. You know, anything beyond that, you're putting a lot of work out for yourself. And you know, I always tell students, like, if you get into all the universities you apply to, you know, the anxiety is kind of back on you where you have made the right choice. But obviously, it's a good problem to have.
Thank you.
Okay. So, yeah, in terms of differences between the US and the UK, I think you've already heard, you know, Harriet and I kind of mentioned them subtly, but we're going to make them a little more explicit here. So, you know, about the extracurriculars, you think it's obviously more, if you focus on your subject, that's the key, right?
Yeah, I do. I think that the extracurriculars are still fundamental, because whilst the universities aren't seeing your softer skills within your UCAS application, it is clearly important that young people develop those skills so that when they actually start at a university, they have, you know, developed their social interaction and you know, done things that aren't just solely academically focused. So, you know, being on a sports team, for example, is a great opportunity to work with people and to show, you know, that you can commit to something and you've got good timekeeping skills, things like that. So I'm not in any way saying that you should just let all of the extracurriculars go and focus only on the academics, because it won't have any benefit in the long run. But when I think about the personal statement itself, I'd say that about 3/4 of it needs to think about the application and the subject that is being applied for, and a quarter at the end would be about your extracurricular interests. I'd say where you can add enormous value to your application that isn't extracurricular but supercurricular is where you are exploring the subject, but in a way that's outside of school. So that might be in your independent reading, listening to podcasts, watching TED Talks, perhaps work experience. There are some degrees that massively benefit from the applicant having completed some work experience, particularly things like medicine. You know, if you haven't done any work experience and you're applying to read medicine, your chances are reduced significantly. And any degree really is going to benefit from you proving that you've done some sort of internship or work experience in your summer holidays. So yes, extracurricular, they're always going to be important and should always be encouraged. But when it comes to the application itself, academics really do come first.
Yeah, it's hard to kind of put the exact weight on how much they value grades versus test scores versus extracurriculars. I wouldn't say they're the 30% or anything like that, but it's definitely it's up there. Like I said, you can list up to 10 for the US, and typically you'd want the first three, maybe even three or four, to be linked to kind of like the same, not activity, but like interest, right? So if I use myself as an example, I played basketball, shocking, in high school. So, I played for my club and I played for my country and I played for my school. So it's like, oh, wow, you're spending a lot of hours playing basketball. But then I also coached basketball at school. I had like a little group of kids, and I eventually started like a basketball camp. And that was kind of my first business experience, was like running these basketball clinics, and I had to hire people and go through kind of safeguarding. And, I felt entrepreneurial in a way. And then I also became a referee. And then, so there's just many different ways. And then also went to basketball camps in the summer, right? So it was very clear on my application, like, oh, this person loves basketball, and he's, doing it in different ways. He's also an ambassador for the sport and getting young people involved, right? So I was able to kind of channel my interest in multiple ways. And then my other activities had nothing to do with basketball, to show that I had a little bit of like, diversity in my life. And then kind of segueing into the essay, when I told my story, I could kind of explain like why I personally love basketball so much, and what I learned from that experience, and why I decided to spend, so many hours, training and traveling and whatnot, and what I learned from all those experiences. And again, my essay, talked about my grandfather, and talked about, being multicultural and, international, all these different things. And they didn't want to hear why I wanted to study history in that particular essay, right? Whereas obviously the UK personal statement, like you said, for the majority is academic in nature. And I think the good thing about the UK personal statement is it often can be like a foundational piece of a supplement, because a lot of supplements will say, well, why do you want to study what you want to study? Right. And in there, you do have to be much more specific and explain, okay, what was your thought process behind some of the choices you made? And then also looking at the university, well, why do you want to come to that university to study it, right? What resources do we offer the university that you feel you can leverage? Like, how do we kind of fit into your long-term kind of plans? And I think that's another, I don't want to say a myth that gets exposed in the US, but a lot of people assume that the US, you should not know at all what you want to study, right? You can be completely undecided. It is liberal arts in nature, where the first 2 years, you don't have to declare your major or your intended course for a lot of schools. If you want to do engineering or computer science, that may be different. But even if you don't know, even if you haven't fully committed, every university still expects you to have like an intended course of study, right? And if you put undecided, you're almost saying like, hey, I just haven't thought about it, right? Where at least you can put like, well, my first choice is this, maybe economics, second choice, music, right? Third choice, math. And it's like, oh, those are very, very different, but you're allowed to have that range and that liberty. And then, the references, like you kind of already said.
Yeah. I think that one point that's there, it does note extenuating circumstances. I think that's another point where it's really important that the reference writer has a good understanding of the applicant and their history. So that particularly applies to someone who maybe has changed schools for sixth form. When you've changed schools for sixth form, the school haven't had as much time, inevitably, to build that relationship with you. And it may be that perhaps you're on track to achieve some very strong A-level results, or whichever other qualifications you're taking, but your historic results were weaker, and it may be because of illness or some sort of family issues or anything that may have impacted your learning. COVID would be an example. And I think this is an opportunity for the school to discuss that and make sure that the university are aware that you've overcome some challenges and are now on the right track to achieving your full potential. So it's important, if there is any sort of background that the university should or could be made aware of, that's noted in the reference. A lot of people say to us, oh, shall I talk about it in my personal statement? I'd say that would be a bad use of the space on your personal statement, because you don't have that much room to work with, and the referee can definitely discuss it in their reference. So that would be it. And I think just in terms of the reference, I can't say it enough, you know, some schools just haven't had as much experience with UK applications as others. So it's important that whoever is providing that reference has been given a really nice long run up to the point where they need to provide it, and it isn't just something that you turn up a week before and say, I'm applying to UK universities, can you write me a reference, and you know, leave them in a bit of a panic mode, and with less time to really put some good thought into what it contains.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, November 1st is the early deadline for the US applications, and we typically want students to ask those teachers in either April or May before the summer, give them like a heads up, be able to, first of all, identify which teachers, make sure you ask them, maybe give them a little bit of guidance of like, hey, I'm applying to this university for, you know, potentially this kind of courses. And, you know, sometimes it is a teacher that saw you in a school club, right? Maybe they do, you know, speech and debate with you, so they can talk about you within the classroom, but also as an extracurricular. And or, you know, you mentioned boarding school, maybe it's a teacher that has like a house role and knows you, you know, in the dining hall and things like that. And the more kind of character revelations that they can share, that's what's going to have value. So again, it's like we encourage students like really develop personal relationships with a few teachers, right? The ones that you respect the most, and maybe it's your favorite class, maybe it's your best class, maybe it's your future field of study. And again, it will just kind of help, right? I don't necessarily mean, you know, suck up and buy them candy. No, just be a very, very real person, and then kind of see where it goes. And then, yeah, finally the interviews. I mean, I just tell kids like, don't worry about the US, but for the, you know, as in like, we'll prep, but it's not going to make or break your application, right? It can be very positive and not help you at all. It can go kind of not great and you can still get in, right? Like it literally does not make or break, but UK quite different.
Yeah, I still would suggest like not being terrified of them, because I feel like the interview's there to be an enjoyable discussion around the subject that you're applying to study at university, and the universities that tend to want to meet candidates to interview them are looking for high level candidates who can adapt well to that situation. So really, if you're not enjoying that interaction, perhaps it's a moment to step back and think, is this the right university for me? And I'd say that, you know, particularly applies to Oxford and Cambridge, who do have this slightly different process. They have an earlier application deadline to other universities as well, which is 15th of October. You know, those universities, the two of them, they have a different teaching style. So they run tutorials where, you know, you are going to be expected to do reading week on week and then discuss it with perhaps one other student and a tutor. And so you are consistently expected to be doing reading and essays, and then being able to talk about that in this very small sort of 2-on-1 setup to a high academic level. And that is actually, you know, for some young people, that is, you know, quite an exhausting prospect, and potentially not actually the way that they best learn. So I think that part of the Oxbridge interviewing process is designed for the, you know, the university to gauge how well the applicant deals with that kind of intense discussion. And you can prepare for that. So, you know, you can try to speak with maybe your teachers, or maybe with a sort of subject specialist tutor or something, one-on-one in preparation for the interview. So you've kind of got to a position where you can read high level material that is related to your course and then discuss it. You know, it's one thing reading something and understanding it, but being able to then put it into words and discuss it with someone else who really knows the subject well is another level of understanding. So I think you can prepare for that, but ultimately, if you're applying to Oxford and Cambridge, you should enjoy that scenario, and so it shouldn't be a worry. You can obviously prepare yourself, and you would want to, you know, anything you'd referenced in your personal statement, you'd want to make sure that prior to the interview, you'd really kind of reviewed that and actually gone above and beyond it so that you can expand upon those interests that you've already mentioned. I'd say for other subjects, things like medicine, the interviews are quite different depending on which medical schools you've applied to. So they have various different methods of interviewing. So it's important to do your homework and understand what type of interview you might have. Some of them might be like one-on-one. Some of them might be more of a group-led interview. Some of them might involve a task. So, do your homework and make sure you know what's coming. But again, you're applying to read medicine, it's competitive, it's academic, it requires a high level applicant, and therefore again I think that if you're not enjoying that, then that's something that should be thought about in advance, which is why starting early and making sure you're making the right decisions for the right reasons is really important.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And it's funny because obviously I hear all that and I'm like, wow, like the US interview is just different, right? And it's hard to kind of predict how the person interviewing you is going to be in terms of like their engagement and their personality. For the most part, if you're an alumni signing up to, interview on behalf of the school, you tend to be pretty outgoing and, you kind of want to give back, right? For a lot of alumni, it's just like a way to preserve that connection to the school. So what I tell our kids, it's like, obviously that person loves the university. If they have any kind of impact on who gets in, and they want to make sure that they take it seriously. But it still tends to be just like an enjoyable conversation, very, very casual. You typically want to have a few anecdotes, personal stories you can kind of turn to, whether it's about like family or background or maybe even travel. Or, I tell someone, it's like, if you say you want to study performing arts and you do live in London and the person says like, oh, like, what's your favorite play? You kind of have like an answer there, right? It's not like, oh, I've never been to a musical. It's kind of like, oh, that doesn't really add up. So you want to think about kind of the way you're presenting yourself, obviously. And you want to ask a lot of questions. And that's a big difference too, right? Well, I'm sure you ask questions in the UK interview, but the questions from the US side, it's like, what did you love about the university during your time there? Where was your roommate from? What was your favorite class? And again, you're trying to have that personal engagement with the interviewer, as opposed to just trying to show that you like are qualified, if you will, academically. So again, these are great learning experiences either way, right? Like having young people be able to advocate for themselves and kind of speak to their passions and their future. So, no one should be too worried about it. And you also want to be careful about, coming across like overly scripted, right? And because sometimes your script might not match the actual way the interview is going. So you have to be, kind of on your toes and an attentive listener throughout as well.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. You don't want to over prepare and have, almost, learning on your lines, because, the discussion is, one that's meant to sort of evolve as you run through the interview. But clearly it's a good idea to be prepared with some of your examples of reading and things you've enjoyed. And the UK universities will also want to know about you personally and why you think you're a good fit for the university. But much like the personal statement, the core of it is about the academic interest and potential.
Okay. As far as the timeline is concerned, so we've kind of try to give you an idea here, starting from year 11, which is obviously 10th grade equivalent to the US. So basically the last 3 years of secondary school. And, there's a few different things here. So I'll let you kind of talk about the Keystone side and the UK side first. Harriet.
Sure. So this is, if anyone's watching this and their child is, already past any of the sort of initial start dates, I wouldn't say you need to sort of necessarily panic in any way. I'd say we've designed this timeline to give applicants the best sort of run up that isn't trying to squash all of your preparation into a very short window. So typically a lot of schools will start sort of talking to students who aren't looking at Oxford and Cambridge in year 12. You don't need to start your application until year 13, because your deadline is January of your final year of school if you're not applying to Oxford or Cambridge. So this really is designed for those that are thinking about the universities that do require that little bit of extra planning. And that is where our guided reading and specialist knowledge modules come in, and what they're designed to do. So very much at the beginning of the process, they're designed to help students kind of really explore their course outside of what they're studying in school. So those might start with just one-on-one with a tutor every couple of weeks, just meeting up to discuss what they've read, and then for the tutor to then be able to recommend some extensions from that. So they start to really hone in on some areas that particularly appeal to them in their chosen course, which then can be utilized if they get to a point of being invited for interview further down the line. That's where you've had your practice of your high level academic discussion with one other person. So they're a real luxury. Like, most people don't have the opportunity to talk about their subject interest one-on-one consistently a long time before they are completing their application. But that area adds enormous value, because what you're learning about can be used within your personal statement and then explored at interview. And then the test preparation, we would recommend starting that towards the end of year 12. So you're studying that just before the start of the summer holidays, and therefore your summer holidays before you start your final year of school can be well used preparing for your entry assessments if you have them, writing your personal statement. So we encourage anyone to return to school in September with a short list of universities, a really, really strong draft of their personal statement, and having completed test preparation, so that you start your new academic year and you don't have to juggle your studies in school, so you still have to get the right grades, with the application, which can, if you leave it all to the last minute, can feel like it's all piling up on your shoulders a little bit.
Okay.
So this timeline really is just a guide. I'd say that it's very up to the individual how it's used, but it gives a good sense of what needs to happen if you want to put forward a really strong application.
So if a student, obviously we're in mid-September or late September right now. If a student says like, oh, okay, UCAS deadline's like in January, like I have time, do they actually still have time?
Yeah, so if they're applying for university in January, so their deadline is the January deadline, that would mean that they're not applying to Oxbridge, right, medicine, veterinary science, those sorts of degrees. It does mean that you have the whole of the autumn term. So yes, but some schools would, ideally prefer you to have completed your UCAS application prior to the kind of Christmas break, because why leave it hanging over the holiday when you can submit it? A lot of people will submit in November, so as soon as the universities receive that, you might be able to receive offers. So, there's no harm in doing that. But in answer to your question, you wouldn't need to panic. You would be encouraged, I'd say, to start thinking about your personal statement quite proactively, because whilst it's not the world's longest document, it does need to pack a punch. This is your only distinguishing feature, that you get to like really clearly portray yourself and why you're a better choice than someone else. And that person who's applying alongside you is likely to have pretty similar profile, similar grades, perhaps done similar things within school, same subjects, things like that. So it's really important to put some effort into your personal statement. It's not something that you can just do last minute. I'd also say, in terms of your relationship with your school, wherever you're at school, they're going to be more accommodating of you and helping you and supporting you if you're clearly working hard towards your goal. So as you say, speaking to the teachers and expressing your interest in studying a subject at university and getting advice and help on that, and speaking to your referee and making sure that they know what your goals are. I think all of this is important when it comes to putting forward your application. And if you do leave it to the last minute with no discernible reason, it doesn't paint a very positive picture. So I would definitely recommend just getting it started now if you're looking for entry next September, and then there's plenty of time this term to get that underway.
And in terms of the offering the places, because you made a good point, right? That like if you submit in November, and I've seen it, some students kind of hear back fairly quickly.
Yeah.
And then other students won't hear back for a while, and they might still get in. How do we kind of explain that to a student, like the timeline of waiting for the answer?
Yeah, so the universities can start making offers immediately. So as soon as UCAS, start taking the next cohort's applications, as soon as they receive those, they can, and they will often have sort of waves of kind of yeses and nos that they will be sending out. So it's not like if you send it off in January, they'll have run out of places. They will leave allocations of places throughout. But some universities are significantly slower because they are dealing with deferred entry, so people who have applied on a gap year, they're dealing with people that are applying with predictions, and they need to make sure that they set aside enough places. They can't over offer. It's a bit of a balancing act. And some of the universities that receive huge numbers of applications, I'd say over the past few years, the London universities have been really slow at making offers. And, that might change. There's not necessarily, a reason that they would do that year on year. But I'd say to applicants, not to worry too much. You can't make any decisions until you've received responses from all of your universities anyway. You're not going to lose an offer once it's been made, unless you don't sort of respond within the sort of reply window. And unfortunately, it is just the reality that some universities will leave it later than others. And it's always quite exciting when people get their first offer, and it might come quickly, but you might get one the week after you apply and then not hear from any of the other universities for months. So it's just unfortunately the way the system works.
Yeah, it's again one of the differences. So in the US, in the early round, you would hear back from your top choice school kind of mid-December. So submitting before November 1st, and then you might hear back from some other schools throughout November and early January. And then for the second round, the regular decision, you don't hear back till kind of end of March, early April. So that's why for our kids, it's like if you already know in December that you've gotten into a few universities, it can make waiting till March or April a little bit more relaxing. Obviously, we always tell students, even the ones who got into their first choice December 15th, they dream come true, right? Like, I got into my top choice school. It doesn't mean you take your foot off the gas. It doesn't mean you stop going to class or you stop working hard. Again, there's another myth that, like, obviously UK, there's your requirements, right? You have to kind of meet your predicted grades, and your offer is based on those predicted grades. If you don't meet them, they rescind the offer. And then the US, that's completely different. You don't have to worry about that. When in reality, the US, the offer says, you've been admitted based on your performance and the expectation that you'll maintain this level. And if you don't maintain that level, they can make things a little bit difficult for you, right? So I want to make sure any student out there listening doesn't just assume like, oh, like once I'm in, I'm done. The work continues. And then for the US timeline, again, this is, 9th grade is year 10 equivalent. 12th grade is year 13. We made it kind of clear here, right, that it starts from 9th grade onwards. Courses matter, grades matter, your commitment to activities matter. And then, of course, if you start exploring potential universities, that can count too. Obviously, the further along the timeline you go, things start to matter more and more. And you also can show growth, right? So let's say if someone gets, a less impressive grade in year 10 and 9th grade, it doesn't mean it's over. If the following year you get better grade, and then again, year after you get even a stronger grade, as long as you're trending upwards academically, you're still kind of in contention. And obviously, if you start at a very high level, you have to kind of maintain that standard kind of throughout, right? You just don't want to have any drop-offs. And then in 11th grade or year 12 is when we kind of start introducing standardized testing to the ACT and SAT, which students can take it multiple times, right? We have a lot of kids who just took the September ACT as kind of their first test. Maybe they'll take either the October or December one is like, okay, I've taken 2 tests before, the Christmas break, the holidays, and then reevaluate, and they might take 2 more in the spring. And again, there's no downside to taking it multiple times. It's just one of those things that's like part of the life of a year 12 student, which is typically in the US, from the US system's point of view, like that's when so many things are happening, right? You're taking your advanced classes, your predicted grades are getting decided in that grade. You're taking SAT scores, SATs, you're probably getting more involved in your extracurriculars. And then in the summer of year 12 going to your final year, or spring/summer, you start working on your essays and your applications. And then, the plan there is by the time you get back to school in September for your final term, your final year, you've kind of like done at least the personal statement, at least the application itself, the bulk of the work, because you still have to get strong, grades and marks, in that final year. And that's also, in the falls when the recommendation letters have to be kind of submitted. And then, we put spring for interviews, but really it can be, November, December for early round. But obviously, if you're applying for the January deadline, you'll have those interviews in January, February. So, again, the timeline is 4 years long. Honestly, if you do something in the summer of 8th grade, so like the summer of year 9 going into year 10, that can also count, right? So let's say if I do like the same, I work at the same lab for 4 straight summers, like you're going to get a lot of credit for that, right? If you kind of keep getting invited to the same lab. Or on the flip side, if you do the same course all 4 years at the same university, you're not going to get as much credit for that, right? That's going to be kind of seen as like, oh, you must have got advice early on and you're trying to almost like game the system. The key is to just pursue your passions like in a genuine way. There is no kind of like, this is the way into this school. It's you have to just show that, you're pursuing your interests in a way that's helping you kind of like, grow your own, personal connection to the subject.
Well,
okay.
Seems like there's quite a lot of overlap in those timelines, just I think fundamentally doing well academically in school, but then exploring your interests and engaging with things outside of school, that can be relevant to both. So if it's sort of overwhelming for people seeing both timelines, I think whilst there are clearly going to be different essays and tests and things towards the end of the process, the earlier elements are very much of the same ilk, and can be done, with the same sort of goals in mind.
Yeah, and like we said, it's we just want students to feel good about the choices that they're making, right? So you can start with a dual track, and you might also have, might be looking at schools in mainland Europe, and Spain and France and Italy, and some kids looking at schools in Singapore, right? Like you have the right to explore everything, but just make sure you allocate enough time for that. Start a little bit earlier. Like I said, if we think about Oxbridge, October 15th, that's typically like the earliest deadline, kind of out there. And then obviously US November 1st for a lot of the early schools, and then November 30th for California schools. And then again, January 1st for more US schools, and then January 15th for more UCAS. You can't be like, okay, if I just like, think about it 1 week out. It's no. It's like months and months and months ahead, right? And that way you can kind of have everything on multiple documents or one Google Doc, and you can kind of see like, oh, okay, like this story can kind of be used, in multiple ways for different processes, right? So again, we've put down here, like you mentioned work experience. Like there's just a work experience is always going to be valuable. Obviously if it's kind of linked to what you want to do later on in life, but even if not, it's like, especially for the US, it's you have an idea what it's like to be in a professional setting, right? You've had to show up on time, you've had to, go through some kind of a background check, whatever it is. It's showing that you're kind of not only going to school, Okay, so those kind of things will be valued in both processes. And then of course, staying organized. You know, everyone's a little bit different in that aspect, but there are a lot of things to kind of check off, right? There's different applications to fill out, and you know, as far as just writing the right email address down and putting down the right number in your actual address, like all these little things matter. So if you kind of wait to the last minute to try to do all at once, you know, you're gonna make these little mistakes that can cost you, even though you've done everything else right. So you got to make sure that you take the time to do everything correctly.
100%.
All right. So again, we have the Q&A feature where you can ask any kind of last minute questions. I know we've kind of gone over the hour mark here, so we'll want to wrap out shortly. So please, if you do have any questions, feel free to ask them now. I don't know, Harriet, anything else? Any kind of final?
No, I think that's great, and I think, you know, we Keystone, for those who are looking at the UK, happy to speak to anyone. Do complimentary initial consultations anyway. So if you are interested, it doesn't cost anything. Just email me, and we can set something up. I think, you know, at this stage, whatever stage your son or daughter are at, you know, just being prepared, having a good sense of what the options are, and then a bit of strategy, even if you're a few years off, can be hugely valuable.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Again, one part of the reason I love doing this is just trying to help kids understand that they can take agency of their future, really evaluate all the options that are out there for them, use the resources that are out there for them, and then just trying to figure out the right fit university for them, right? And, you know, I hear a lot of kids come to me and say, I want to go to Stanford, I want to go to Harvard. And that's all great. And you can definitely reach for the stars and you can be very, very ambitious. The reality is that there's just so many good options out there. So as long as you explore them, you know, the right way, I think that people in your life will understand that you're going to end up basically exactly where you're supposed to be. And as long as that's you know, somewhere that's going to lead to happiness and success and self-fulfillment, I think everyone's going to be, you know, happy about it. So, all right. I don't believe there are any questions from the audience. It's always a good sign.
I think we're going to be, we've recorded this, haven't we? So,
yes.
You know, we will, you know, send it around to people as well, but, you know, we'll have it on our website, on our blog page. We'll pop the recording, and so if anyone wants to access it there, we'll share it around, then it will be there to be found on our blog.
Okay. All right, everyone, thank you so much for attending, and I hope you enjoy a great rest of your day. Harriet and Keystone, thank you for joining us as well.
Thank you for organizing. It's good to see you, Josh.
You too. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.